Right, Harold, welcome back to Responsible Travel.
Thank you.
Start by asking, why should we worry about tourism? Why are we worrying about tourism?
I worry about it because it's 10% of consumption globally. It's a big cause of carbon emissions. It's also very important to people. We need to get it right. People work hard all year, very often, to raise the money to go on holiday. I remember once we realised that for most people it's the single biggest consumer item that they buy each year, and the industry needs to get it right. It needs to be a good experience for the tourist.
Do you think in some other spheres it's considered a sort of trivial industry, or maybe frivolous is the word I would use? But do you think the industry as a whole, in terms of regulation and perception, suffers from being frivolous and isn't taken seriously?
I think there's a serious problem about it being regarded as frivolous, often by destination governments, which means that they don't regulate it as much as they probably ought to, but also by outbound governments as well. The source market governments also tend to see tourism as just a bit of fun on the side, almost an affair that people have. And I think that is a challenge for the industry, but there are lots of people in the industry now who are taking it very seriously and are concerned about the authenticity of the experiences they offer, the quality of those experiences, and the impacts of tourism in the destinations. Increasingly, the consumer is expecting the person selling them the holiday to have looked into the sustainability and the responsibility questions about that product and to address them. It's the last thing you want to do when you're on holiday is to worry about it. You want to have a guilt-free trip.
I mean, that idea of guilt-free holidays is one that I recognise, but I think undersells the potential of responsible tourism. And there's a couple of reasons for that, which maybe you could talk about, we could discuss. The first is something we've been discussing for many years, and that tourism is very unusual in that I never get to see the conditions in the sweatshop where my trainers were made.
Yeah.
Tourism is unusual. Perhaps you could talk about why tourism is unusual in that regard. And secondly, if you could also talk a little bit about the link between perhaps authenticity and responsible tourism. Because I think those are the two keys.
They are absolutely key.
To saying that guilt-free undersells the consumer benefit of responsible tourism.
You often hear it said, don't you? Certainly when I talk to my friends about the holiday they've just had and what they remember about it, very often it's an encounter with somebody, with another human being in another culture. And, you know, I'm off to the Gambia tomorrow, and very much the same kind of thing. Lots of the tourists who go there, they're going there for a guilt-free holiday, but they're also wanting that sense of what's local life really like. We did research there a few years ago. An awful lot of people will spend time in a Gambian's compound in their home as part of their holiday. So people want that experience of what life is really like for the other. It's that pursuit of the exotic. Now, I don't think you necessarily need to go very far to have that experience of the other. We might talk about that. But the guilt-free thing is because the tourist is travelling to the factory. You can't ignore where that tourist experience is being created for you.
So are you saying that it's easier to hide bad practices in the manufacturing and fashion industries than it is in the tourism industry, because the tourist actually meets the local person who's affected, sees the impacts, the environmental impacts firsthand? Are you saying that it's made obvious to the tourist in tourism in a way that it's not in other industries?
I don't think it's always obvious to the tourist. My point is that if we can raise the awareness amongst travellers about the kind of things to look for, then we will begin to have a big impact. I'm just back from Chile, for example, and the person I was travelling with, a research scientist from Bangor University, has got video footage of waste being discharged into the bay at Cape Horn. Now, if we could imagine, Justin, if we could persuade tourists to actually share that footage that they've got on a website, which would bring out the ways in which the industry exploits and damages the environment.
But on a simpler level, you know, a tourist, for example, visiting sub-Saharan Africa, is going to be aware that the animals they're seeing are very endangered.
Yes.
Is going to be aware of the wealth disparity between themselves and local people.
Yes.
In a way that somebody buying a cheap T-shirt from a retailer is not.
I think that's right.
It's evident.
And it is very evident, and it's very clearly the case that some people choose not to go to particular continents because they're worried about poverty. and they don't want to see it, and one understands that. And you know, in Cape Town, they've talked about calling the township suburbs in order to remove the stigma of them still being called townships. There is that negativity, but the reality is that any traveller who travels with their eyes open will see those kinds of problems.
So doesn't that give you hope that the tourism industry over time will change faster than perhaps some of the other industries?
I think that will happen if we're able to encourage the tourists to actually talk about it when they come back, share their experiences. But it won't change automatically. It needs to be made to change. But you look at the number of people who go abroad and see, for example, suffering donkeys. You know, the number of donkey sanctuaries which are funded by tourists, the number of cat neutering programs which exist around the world, again funded by tourists. In Barcelona, they removed the pet stalls from the Ramblas because the tourists didn't appreciate it. So there are indications that it makes a difference. I think there are other areas where people get very confused. So if you look at orphanage tourism, for example, a lot of people go to orphanages, they see a child who's living in an orphanage apparently in dire straits, but they don't see where that child came from. They don't see that child may have been trafficked, where the orphanage is making so much money from attracting tourists and taking money from them that they go out actively looking for orphans. People don't see that, and in a way I think we need to help them to see it and to avoid it, because there's nothing worse than somebody coming back and realising later how awful that experience was and what they contributed to, because that's where the guilt comes from, often years later.
Why hasn't more happened in that regard in terms of consumer awareness over the last 20 years?
Well, I think because it is easy to hide things in the factory. You know, in the same way that when a factory inspector goes around looking at health and safety in a place, it's all cleaned up. When the tourist goes, you don't really see behind the doors. But of course, tourists are able to ask questions and to engage and to ask questions of their operators. We need to empower consumers, really. They want a good holiday. They don't want to feel guilt about it. They want to have an authentic experience. They want to get closer and closer to the animals, to the wildlife, and to the communities. And that, I think, is one of the reasons that it's changing.
I mean, typically what you might see in other sectors is a wide range of NGOs who are very active in sharing the agenda, and a media of which a segment will be quite investigative or really independent in their thinking. Do you think we see either of those in the tourism industry?
No, we don't. That's clearly an issue. The success that NGOs were having campaigning about tourism, say 10 years ago, has declined, I think. They are less and less able to get themselves funded. So there isn't, and certainly there aren't travel journalists writing investigative pieces about the travel experience and about the transport which travellers use. And that's a great puzzle for me, because if I'm stuck on a train on a wet Sunday, nothing to read, I'm more likely to read the motoring pages, and I'm not particularly interested in motoring, than I am the travel pages. And that's partly because the motoring pages are more critical.
Harold, you've been an inspiration. You've been the driving force behind all of this. I thank you very much. Whenever we were lax, you were always on our back. You were always telling us never, never to be tired about what we say, about what we do. You've been a driving force in all the sense of the word. Thank you for all your good work. Thank you, everybody.